You are at war with yourself and likely don't realize it. Your thoughts, beliefs, habits, and actions often sabotage you. Are they helping you overcome adversity or setting you up for failure? To win this battle, you must connect with your inner warrior. We all have a warrior within us, one that strengthens our resolve and helps us to rise to meet life's challenges. If you're just surviving rather than thriving, then it's time to embrace the warrior archetype, live the warrior ethos, and ascend. If you are a veteran, first responder, or someone looking to take charge of your life, find your tribe, and then be the hero of your own story, this podcast is for you. Join Mike Kinney and Matt Hastings, two retired U.S. Army officers who served in U.S. Army Special Operations and Army Aviation units, as they share with you optimal performance practices they learned in their time with the Military and Warriors Ascent, a 501c3 nonprofit that helps veterans and warriors with PTS.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Warriors Ascent podcast with your hosts, Mike and Matt. And the topic for today is healing and tending the mind. So we feel this to be absolutely integral to, I'll say, mental health and well-being, healing for that matter, but then also high performance as well. You know, and Matt and I, we've got, I'll say, plenty of anecdotes, wherein that is held true. No, so really, in a nutshell, one of the major facets of the Warriors Ascent program, for healing is the what I'll call the metacognitive, thinking about your thinking, right? So we give our participants a variety of metacognitive rubrics, and we'll go over a few that we find to be exceedingly useful. But really, in the end, it's about healing and disciplining the mind. And in application, really what it is that we're looking to be, for all intents and purposes, are warriors of the mind. So in terms of, I'll say, philosophy and stoicism, hearkening back to Marcus Aurelius and, a lot of the Stoic philosophers, people tend to think, philosophers are nerds, or at least maybe in today's day and age. But back then, philosophy was readily applied, right? So the Stoic philosophers, as an example, used everything that they learned and applied it to their daily lives to live, fulfilling and wholesome lives. And our pursuit is no different. So the first rubric we're going to talk about is, we've borrowed it from Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. And what he talks about are systems 1 and 2 thinking. And this is a very important construct because it really kind of lends insight into how your mind works, how it processes thoughts, and how that impacts your emotions, actions, all of that. So just to kind of make that real. System 1 and System 2 thinking. So System 1 is really intuitive, fast, automatic, effortless, emotional, and efficient. So really, in essence, what you're talking about there are habits, routines, learned patterns of behavior that you've experienced and learned throughout your entire life, to include childhood and even up through adulthood. So these are things that happen automatically, the thoughts, or the habits that you don't have to think about. And I'll defer to Matt shortly about, some of his military anecdotes that I think will hit that concept home. But System 2, on the other hand, are your logic and reasoning, right? So that's slow, conscious, deliberate, effortful, logical, and explicit. So think in terms of mathematical computation. It's onerous, very, I'll say, energy intensive. Everyone rolls their eyes when it's like, solve this problem. And you're left like, oh my God, this is going to take so much energy and work. I'd rather just guess at an answer. Well, there's a reason for that because it is very effortful. So it's been said that System 2 is lazy System 2. It more often than not wants to defer to System 1 because it's intuitive. It's a snapshot. It's relatively easy. But there are instances where that serves you well. And, Matt and I both have examples in the military where our System 1 is taken over and I'll say averted near disaster. But there are also instances where System 1 fails you. Those learned patterns of behavior, they don't serve you well. Those are habits and practices not learned properly, and they're resulting in, I'll say, suboptimal patterns of behavior. So that's the framework, the abstract logical framework. I'd ask Matt to make it real with some military anecdotes, if you would.
I mean, some of the things for the System 1 discussion is the Army was incredibly good, especially Army aviation, in making us do repetition. And it was, at first, you're like, why do we have to memorize so much stuff? And we would have the emergency procedures where they were underlined in huge amounts of just memorizing these. And in the instructor pilots, if you got one letter wrong, you fail the whole thing because it's an emergency procedure. It's so important. And, same thing was true when we did emergency procedures. First, we'd drill it just talking at the table, and then we'd go into a simulator where now we're like taking our hands and doing things with controls and buttons and switches. And we do it so much. And finally, you're in the aircraft with an instructor pilot, and he's, we're simulating things, we're doing real things, to the point where it's just so ingrained in you that you don't notice it. But there's times, suddenly flying along in a helicopter, for instance, and you need to know this. You need to react quickly when a lot's going on. And I had a big story. I don't know if this is the time to.
No, please. Yeah. Share
All right, it's an Iraq story. And this is one of those things. We're doing really complicated missions in the middle of the desert. So we had a very experienced crews. I was a CW3 that had been selected for CW4, waiting my turn. And the next guy next to me was the CW3. And both of us had flown a lot together in this environment. We had flown, put ground forces in to an objective area. And we hang around as long as we can in case they need an emergency exfil. But we needed to go get fuel. And it was kind of a distance to go. So we were flying across this desert, nothing to see. I mean, you can't tell sky from ground from nothing. It's just NVG green. That's all you could tell.
Right.
And suddenly, the rotor system makes this terrible noise and nothing but red in the panel in front of us. And when your instruments turn red, that's not good.
That's not good.
Well, the Army's, we're pretty smart, but red, green, and yellow, that makes some color coding happen. So we see all this red, and I just remember thinking in my brain going, holy crap, what am I going to do with this? But when I recognized, my hand was already up on this power control lever, and I was pulling it back, and I was manipulating this thing to control the engines, control the rotor system. All the while, I was just like, holy cow, I'm actually already doing this. And then I looked up, and we were about to crash into the ground, and I noticed my other pilot was also watching and thinking, and I said, who's flying? And he corrected, and we flew out there, and like, holy cow. We both were so ingrained in what was happening that we weren't paying attention to the easy stuff. But the reason I think that it was hard, because at the same time, we had a bigger problem. We had troops on the ground.
Right.
We needed fuel. We had an emergency that said land right now, but we can't land right now. This is bad guy territory. We got to get somewhere where we're safe. We got to get somewhere where we can get somebody else to get our ground force out of there. We got bigger problems. And so we're doing multiple problem sets at once. But I'm going to tell you that System 1, in that repetition and rehearsal, it just was, life-saving.
Well, it's energy saving, and it's a survival mechanism, because if you had to think deliberately, but every action that you needed to take to save your life, you'd be killed.
Yeah.
And no difference in the level that they trained you doing a complex operation like flying an aircraft. That they ingrained those I'll say perfect practices in you. So please continue.
And this is one of those things where that really worked out well. We talk about, hey, that one served me well. One is a time that we recognize as warriors, so we talked about earlier that was a reason that we would want that to up our performance level, to have maximum performance. Another thing we'd want to do is heal our mind. So as we're now in a different part of our life cycle as warriors, and I said earlier, warrior at rest, trying to figure out how to have value and purpose. sometimes these things aren't serving us well. And that's kind of where we get in trouble, and we have to recognize it. And I think some of the things we talk about is taking that same intensity level, driving, for instance. I know I still struggle with this. I know I still see, nobody pays attention to the rules. Nobody's following the laws and the procedures. And as a guy who goes, we used to go through annual check rides, we call them, evaluations, to see if we're still doing it right, if we still know our rules, we're following them properly. Super hard, super stressful stuff. And then you look at a regular car driver, and they could be driving a car 25 years with only having one test ever in the very beginning. So, we talked about it. It can be maddening to watch other people not be within procedure, not be within whatever. So road rage is a tough one for me, and I think it's a tough one for others.
Yeah, I think a lot of that stems from just expectations, expectation management, and all that stuff, that you've had to, operate at a high level. The units that you've been in, you've had that expectation of other people. But to that point, you talked about, when we discussed before, the instructor pilots, making sure, whether when you were one, and then when you were being instructed, that they took great pains to make sure that you did everything correctly. So we'll say, for the sake of argument, your system 2, where they make you go through all your check rides, all of your maneuvers, all of that, making sure that you did it to the letter of the law, to ingrain those habits. And we talked about before, it's not, practice makes perfect. It's perfect practice makes perfect.
That's exactly right. And that's what you want, because so another thing we used to say, this was the psychobabble stuff, they called it, when we were going through instructor pilot course. And they would say that it was the law of primacy, they called that. And what it really just means is, if you learn something wrong in the beginning, like you just discussed, then it is unbelievably hard to unlearn that. In fact, near impossible. So what we want to do is ensure that initial learning is correct, and that it's just like you said, perfect practice.
Right.
And we're really, really strict on it. And I've had so many cases where I was in an aircraft with a lot going on, and oh my gosh, what's happening? And automatic responses take over, and I fix the aircraft, and then you have time to think things through, and you're kind of mostly doing this simultaneously. So it's an incredible skill, and it's also something that we have to watch out for.
Right.
Because what do we always say? That we bring the warrior to the right scenario is what we're trying to do.
Right. No, absolutely. But in as much as, system 1 and system 2, the Army says, train as you fight. What's the other saying? You don't rise to the occasion, you fall to the lowest level of your training. All to say that if you don't learn this properly, if you don't train for, say, adversity or contingencies, I know we talked about that. The whole PACE plan that was big in the Special Forces, primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency.
Yes.
And again, that's all just disciplining your mind. The what if this goes on? What if this goes wrong? But having those ingrained in you properly, and call them battle drills. React to ambush, near and far. React to, indirect fire, blah, 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 things that you're not doing deliberate planning. It's not writing an op order. It's not Ranger school bay planning. It's
you guys would go into 96 hours of isolation planning. Talk about that a little bit.
So in Special Forces, I'll say planning was absolutely critical. Everything from area studies, to get regional area orientation, language immersion, you name it. We would never go off half-cocked or haphazard when going into country. So planning, I will say, was part of the organizational culture. So that was very important. And Ranger School, same way. You would do your bay planning, operations order, and it would be Nats has detail, crazy stuff, where people are on the perimeter, who's manning the crew served weapon, you name it.
And you had everything, contingencies. You said that pace for everything, like for your communications,
for LZs, PZs,
yeah, that means
commo.
where the helicopter's going to pick me up, where it's going to drop me off.
Right.
And that's what we did too. I would have
Yep.
5 different places to land you, and all of them were event driven. If this happens, then do this.
Right.
And those were amazing plans.
But by the same token, so that's, we'll say system 2 constructs.
Right.
But the system 1, battle drills, CQB, right? So close quarters battle, room clearing and stuff like that. A little bit of a shift, so we went from very, very deliberate to, all right, flow drills, and you need to know where you are in the stack and what your responsibility is.
Right.
Really more reacting to, I'll say, the layout of the room or whatever it might be. No real time to deliberate and go, okay, how are we going to do this? You just need to know.
Right.
So again, very system 1. And I talked about battle drills as an example where somebody's shooting at you. You're not, well, geez, what do I do now? You're trained. Boom, boom. So none of this is new to our experience, I'll say, in the military. Where I think it's important and applicable is realizing that, as we talked about before in your case, if you incorrectly learned those routines and procedures, your aircraft would fall out of the sky, right? So it's absolutely imperative that you learned properly, and those instructor pilots made abundantly clear, what that standard was. Yes.
Right. And we had things that were the immediate action. And it's like, that was very clear. This was what you immediately do. Just like you said, there's no thinking. It's a very similar mindset across the branches in the Army. And I'm assuming in the military branches on how they train us to that standard where we aren't thinking really, unless we're, prepping the plan. We used to say in the aviation community, the minute you take off, the plan flies out the window.
Right.
Because, there's so many variables that can change on you. So, but you just knew what the end state was, and you knew like left and right limits, and you knew how to get, because we planned for almost everything you could think of.
Well, Eisenhower, one of my heroes, and I'm paraphrasing, but he would say, the plan is nothing, planning is everything. So it's kind of, I think I'll attribute it to, Napoleon disciplining the mind of the commander. Meaning, all right, planning is the rigor with which you look at a situation and say, okay, what do I need to do, or what if? And that's really important. No, so with regard to what it is that we're trying to, I'll say, underscore for our audience and how it's relevant to their lives, everyone, I think, you, me, so we talked about our military careers, or at least, portions of them. But after the fact, we've been faced with situations, right? And we talked about this as well, where so much of those habits are ingrained, and it's more even just than habits, it's mindsets, standards, values.
Big time about living a value system.
Ethics and virtues, or whatever, like, hey, you will cross the line of departure on time. And I know with Task Force 160th, it's plus or minus 30 seconds, no matter what. That's the standard, to where you then bring that into the civilian world, which is a little extreme. But I would say for myself, it's just like you get a little agitated when, why aren't we on time? Or how come this, or how come that? And you lose sight of the fact that, in the military, not to be overdramatic, but sometimes lives hang in the balance. You're synchronizing assets and resources and artillery and aircraft and all of these things. And if you mess that up, things can go very poorly, very quickly. And if you're not, I'll say, attuned enough to realize that, well, you don't need to bring the warrior to every situation, as we've talked about before. And it's similarly that same mindset. It's like, you don't have to be absolutely time on target to everywhere that you're going, and having, the wherewithal to say, all right, I'm getting worked up, or trying to uphold a standard, those ingrained system 1 habits that, quite frankly, don't necessarily apply here?
I know, and I used to say, well, gosh, these are all good things to help you out, like backwards planning. We got to get to the airport for a flight. It's at this time. They want you there at this time.
Right.
We just backwards plan all the way to waking up and breakfast and everything. And a lot of people don't want to go through this planning sequence with you.
Right.
And they just kind of want to be like, no, you get to the airport and it's like, wow.
When we show up, it's all going to be good. And to be fair, many times that is the case. There are the quote unquote, the no fail missions. We've all been on those. And even, I'll say life after the Army, there's certain things that you don't want to be late for, or other important things that I'll say our military upbringing has served us well, meeting certain standards. But again, having the wherewithal to say, okay, am I getting worked up over something that really is, I'll say, inconsequential or not that big of a deal?
Right.
Or am I trying to uphold a standard that really, quite frankly, does not apply here? And it's causing me a lot of friction, both internal angst where I'm getting really worked up, or even friction with friends and family and coworkers where they're like, why is it that this guy is so hard to work with? Or, oh my God, he's just really strict, or whatever it might be.
Well, then I had written down a trigger. Let's say something zapped you a little bit. Like we were saying, what if you're driving along the highway and you see a pile of trash and you're the only person in the car that suddenly, it's not a bomb, a roadside bomb, but for some reason, here comes like this little bit of adrenaline and you're just trying to, I don't know, maybe you just see it. How do you deal with it?
That's system one, again, those ingrained habits, it's hard.
And it's not something that you can really control. So you've got to have a mechanism, in which you think recognizing the scenario you're in is majorly important.
Right.
And not dealing with those newfound like triggered emotions, because, and I think we're going to talk more about this when we finally get to CBT training and actions, thoughts, emotions.
No, but what we've said early on, you don't need to bring the warrior to every situation, which is important. But to your point, when you're saying, is there a way to remedy or address this? So for those that are, listening, if in your mind you're conceptualizing instances where, I do. I get into a particular situation. I always have the same argument with my wife or husband or a coworker, neighbor, kids, doesn't matter. Or these certain situations stress me out, or I find myself getting very agitated or even despondent, whatever it might be. I would recommend, kind of look at that pattern of behavior. And as we've pointed out, system one is certainly not all bad. In many instances, it's a life-saving measure. And at the very least, an energy conservation measure. Having deliberate thought and calculations is very onerous. So I know that's kind of the shortcut. But bottom line is, if there are instances where you're like, I keep on falling into these recurring patterns of behavior where it does not end well for me, what am I doing? I would look at those system one patterns, those routines, and say, okay, I need to make some changes. And, Kahneman will say the only thing that can help you reprogram system one is system two, right? Your deliberate thinking. And there are a few techniques that we teach at Warriors Ascent to do that. One is called pre-commitments, meaning, plan ahead. If you know that, hey, when I'm faced with this situation, I typically don't respond well. And here's why. Or certain people trigger me. We've all run into those types of people. You're like, whenever I have a discussion with this dude or dudette, I just want to strangle them, and you realize it's not going to be fruitful. What can you do? What are the alternate thoughts? Or how can you plan ahead with contingencies, as we've talked about before, to say, when that happens, I'm going to do this. And there's related to that, something they call if-then implementation intention. So that for the computer programmers out there, little Boolean logic, right? If-then, right? If I'm faced with said situation or person or scenario, whatever it might be, then this is what I'm going to do. Call it an alternate thought, an alternate action, an alternate course of action. because now you're planning ahead. And in dialectical behavior therapy, they call that coping ahead, realizing that, hey, let me plan ahead, let me be prepared, and let me have some mechanisms or contingencies in place such that I can anticipate that, recruit my system to deliberate thinking, to take control of my system one in those situations where really, quite frankly, system one is not serving me. So that would be, the big takeaway, for today, for this lesson.
If you're a military planner and you are like me, used to offering 3 courses of action or having 3 different landing zones and having 5 different options of, frequencies for communication if we need to, like this is a great way to do this. Already think contingency levels, these are the things that could happen. Here's what I'm going to do. Probably going to happen. So I expect that to happen. Expectation management. And I can walk into a scenario and basically go, yep, Karen over there did make me mad. And, I don't know what you call a male Karen.
Kevin. I think
it's Kevin.
It's Karen and Kevin.
Yeah, Kevin, and the HOA over there can really get to me, but I'm just going to laugh through it today, or whatever it is. So you just pre-plan. I really like that as
pre-commitments, cope ahead. Absolutely.
As I'm trying to take myself off of military things, and it still is a really good way to offer up different contingencies in your brain. I like it. It works for me.
Oh, perfect, man. So we'll cover, the cognitive behavioral triangle, which is another useful construct in another podcast episode. So hope this was useful. It was fun.
Yeah.
Appreciate you, brother.
Yeah, man.
Hi, Matt Hastings here, sending a thank you for watching this episode of the Warriors Ascent podcast. We strive to build a community of warriors made up of our nation's veterans and first responders. And to reach as many of those in need as possible, we need your help. Please just smash that like button and comment or share our content. Warriors Ascent is a Kansas City-based nonprofit that aids veterans and first responders with PTS. I went through this effective program and want those that are struggling to find what I found. Check us out on our website at warriorsascent.org.